Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the scale of the damage caused by Spain's floods is said to be incalculable. But is weather solely to blame for the devastation, or is a lack of preparedness for climate change also to blame? The war on Gaza is stranding the Palestinian economy. Israel has agreed to allow its banks to cooperate with Palestinian ones, but will extending the lifeline for just a month make any difference? And Africa's abundant energy resources could transform economies on the continent. They could also help the world make the transition to clean energy, yet it seems unable to tap into its good fortune. We'll take a look at why that is. It is Spain's worst natural disaster in recent history, and some scientists are linking it to global warming. Devastating floods across the eastern region of Valencia have destroyed roads, railways, infrastructure and businesses, and have covered entire towns with mud. Recovery efforts are still underway, with the nation's biggest peacetime recovery operation, but the total cost is expected to be enormous. The government has approved more than $11 billion in loans and grants to help storms and flood victims. But many Spaniards are outraged by what they say is the slow response to the crisis and a lack of warning in advance of the flooding. The criticism is extended to the rest of the European Union, with concerns about the bloc's preparedness for climate change. Victoria Gatenby reports.
Spain's deadliest floods in decades have cost the country dear. Hundreds of people have been killed. Hundreds of millions of euros are needed to rebuild the devastated region. In one area of Valencia, a year's worth of rain fell in one day.
There was no warning. In 20 minutes, everything was covered in water.
Valencia's regional government sent out a text message warning residents of the storm 8 hours after the first floods were reported. It was too late for many who found themselves trapped in low-lying homes, shops and roads that were quickly overwhelmed by rapidly moving floodwaters.
It's just catastrophic. It was like a reservoir here. There was no way to get rid of the water. It's terrible.
Spain's weather department says a rare cold front moving over the warm waters of the Mediterranean caused atmospheric instability, leading to exceptionally heavy rainfall. Another example, it says, of extreme events caused by climate change. Others say uncontrolled urban development of the Valencia region contributed to the scale of the flooding.
There's been a lot of urban development, people moving into the area, huge population densities in some places. So all of these changes to the way that the cities function mean that more people are at risk.
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says what happened in Spain highlights Europe's unpreparedness for climate change.
In just a few months, floods have hit Central and Eastern Europe, Italy and now Spain. This is the dramatic reality of climate change, and we must prepare to deal with it all across our union.
Spanish authorities have released emergency funds to begin repairs to roads, railways and other infrastructure, but total reconstruction costs are expected to be staggering. Spain's Prime Minister said outside help is needed.
We are in communication with the European Commission, and we have begun the procedures to request aid from the European Solidarity Fund and the use of other community support resources from the European Union.
The government says all the resources of the state will be directed to Valencia to help people rebuild their shattered lives. But many here are angry at the slow response to the disaster, and trust is in short supply. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Joining us now from Munich is Dr. Miranda Schroers, Chair of Environmental and Climate Policy at the Technical University of Munich. Good to have you with us, Miranda. Was climate change or the regional government in Valencia to blame for the sheer scale of this disaster, or maybe even the national government in Madrid? How are the three interlinked?
Well, certainly climate change played a big role. We've had years of drought in Spain, followed by a year's worth of rain in a day and soil that just couldn't absorb that water. But at the same time, governments need to be prepared for what's coming with climate change. And that means the need for very rapid and effective early warning systems, sirens, communication messages that happen before the flood hits and not after. We've seen the same problem elsewhere, also in Germany a few years ago with the Ahr River catastrophe. The same thing happened. It was too late that the warnings came out. So it's a European problem. And within Spain, we just haven't seen enough attention being given to the need for redesigning our urban communities that are growing so rapidly to deal with these sudden kinds of rains. We need sponge cities that can absorb water and not just have that water flood through paved cities where there is no way for that water to be channeled to the sea without flooding entire cities.
And what about the wider EU? Are EU states taking the threat of climate change seriously enough? Are they investing enough in preparedness?
The EU certainly has climate change high on its agenda. It's established many different laws to try to change the causes and reduce the emissions coming from greenhouse gas burning. But climate adaptation is another part of the picture. Climate adaptation means getting prepared for the changing weather conditions that we can expect in the years ahead. That means long periods of drought. It means periods of heavy rains. It can mean very strong storms with super high winds. And all of this requires us to rethink how we can make our cities and our urban infrastructure more resilient. We need to be prepared for Mother Nature letting out its fury and being prepared to deal with that as best as possible. And that means everything from rethinking infrastructure design, working better with nature. We've removed nature from too much of our urban areas as well as from the rural areas. Forests have been decimated. We have taken away the natural flows of rivers. We need to rethink how we live with nature rather than living against nature.
And what about the cost of all of this, Miranda? Who pays? Who compensates those of us who are affected by climate change-related disasters? In Spain, it's the Natural Disaster Insurance Agency is beginning to compensate victims. What does it mean for insurance companies, and how much money governments have to set aside to compensate people so that they can rebuild?
You know, the costs are enormous and they are climbing. The European Environment Agency put out a report last year that shows that just in the previous 2 years, the costs, the damages cost from natural disasters linked to climate change are almost equal to the entire economy of Hungary for a year. That's an enormous sum of money. And the floods in Spain are going to be astronomically expensive. Insurance companies cover a part of those costs, but much of the cost is not covered by insurance companies. And that means that people are either left on their own or the government has to come in and help. And governments are already overburdened with so many costs. And so this also goes back to your question about planning. We need to be doing longer-term planning that helps us think about what kinds of investments are being made so that we become more resilient. Because if we don't, we're going to have the next flood and we're going to have the next drought, and it's going to cause massive damage. And of course, that affects the lives of people. That affects the farmers. That affects the cities. We've seen the sad, sad deaths that occurred in Spain and earlier in other places in Europe. So yes, we need to rethink how we invest so that our investments are done to better prepare against these costs, which will significantly rise as climate change continues apace.
Doctor, it's been really good to have you on Counting the Cost. Miranda, many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Israel's war on Gaza has plunged the Strip into a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. The economy in the occupied West Bank, seen as the core of any future Palestinian state, is also suffering. Attacks by Israeli soldiers and settlers, as well as roadblocks, are making it difficult for Palestinians to move around and work in the occupied territory. Meanwhile, around 150,000 Palestinian workers have been denied entry into Israel to work. Under pressure from the US, Israel's finance minister has agreed to extend cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian banks. The waiver will allow the Palestinian Authority to process shekel payments for services and salaries, but for just another month. Washington says the move creates another looming crisis and warns of the region's economic collapse. Fintan Monaghan reports.
Palestinian workers in Israel used to bring much-needed cash to the occupied West Bank. They made up an estimated 22% of the workforce before the war in Gaza began last October. But since Israel banned their entry, they barely make up 2%, according to the International Labour Organization. In the same period, GDP in the occupied West Bank has dropped by almost a quarter, and unemployment has soared to almost 32%. Another obstacle facing the economy is that the Palestinian Authority does not have its own currency. It uses the Israeli shekel. Palestinian banks are forced to rely on their Israeli counterparts to process transactions. A one-month extension to an agreement allowing Israeli banks to cooperate with Palestinian banks was recently signed by Israel's finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, but only hours before the deal was due to expire.
Smotrich's priority has always been full annexation of the West Bank and continued settlement building in the West Bank. So he wants to have the finances and the tax revenues as a card that he can use in exchange for a license from the government to continue sanctioning the settlement building and legalizing the settlements that are already built there.
In a rare joint statement, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called for Israel to extend the deal by a year. They said, "Unfortunately, the very short-term duration of this extension creates another looming crisis by November 30th, exacerbating uncertainty for international banks, Israeli companies operating in the West Bank, and most importantly, for ordinary Palestinians who bear the greatest brunt of such uncertainty." In the occupied West Bank, it's difficult to miss the devastating economic impact from the war. People say every day the conflict continues, it adds another burden, one they may need decades to recover from. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
From Ramallah, we're joined by Raja Khalidi, who's the Director General of Palestine Economic Policy Research Institute. Good to have you with us. The Palestinian territories are already nearing economic freefall, according to the World Bank. What would happen if Palestinian banks remain cut off from Israel's financial system? Are they still able to do business via international banks?
Yes, indeed, they are, and they continue to. There is a Palestinian SWIFT. There are direct Palestinian banking relations with the rest of the world. But those transactions only account for a relatively small percentage of the total transactions, let's say, of the Palestinian economy. So compared to the 12 to $13 billion a year of trade, tax revenues that are transferred to the government, workers' remittances, that's the number, the level that we had until October 7th last year. Compared to that, the transactions with the rest of the world are in the small, $1 or $2 billion dollars. And hence, cutting off would mean pushing the Palestinian economy to the extent possible into greater trade and financial transactions with Jordan, through Jordan with the rest of the world, the Gulf, etc. So this is part of one of the critical impacts that, if the decision is or if this waiver is not renewed, the sort of impacts that we're talking about are multi-level. That is only one. One of them is the reorientation of trade. Another one is the definancialization of the economy. Another one is the cash black market that will and has actually already started taking shape in foreign exchange. So, I mean, it's one of many, of several sanctions that Smotrich, but let's not over-personalize this. This is the Israeli government under Prime Minister Netanyahu with a very appropriate frontman for all of this very hostile financial.
Roger, you alluded to it in your answer there, but how much money crosses between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories in terms of trade every year? How much is that trade worth?
Trade is about $5 billion. Clearance revenues, i.e. the tax that Israel transfers in the form of shekels to the Palestinian Authority on imports, on trade, is another $3 or approximately $1 billion. And then up till recently, you have another $4 or thereabouts billion of workers' income from work in Israel.
All right.
So that's around 12 to 13. And I think the 13 million was mentioned in the first letter of the G7 when they warned Smotrich.
So can either economy afford the continuation of this if the waiver isn't extended? I mean, Israel just has as much to lose as the occupied West Bank, doesn't it?
Well, so far this has created a great degree of market uncertainty and as I mentioned, not burgeoning but a emerging black market and a wide degree of cash of shifting to cash rather than banking transactions. Now, for us, it's a major challenge, obviously, because of the shekel is the main currency in circulation. For Israel, I don't think they see it currently as an economic issue. Economic relations between the PA and Israel since '94 have been basically a security file, which Israel, part of the security file in terms of Israel's control of the West Bank of the PA and its ability to contain any sort of separation. Now, this move, paradoxically, the Palestinian, experts and the PA has been calling for many years for "quote unquote" disengagement from the colonial dependency on the Israeli economy, and that entails lots of investment in productive capacity and changing the direction of trade, etc., which hasn't happened in a major way. Paradoxically, Israel is now forcing that separation to proceed. So, how it will take shape, it's going to be a very, poverty is widespread. Employment has not picked up in the wake of a year of there are a number of critical pressures building in this economy. But ultimately, if Israel wants to play that game, it's going to pay as well, because whatever trade will remain between Israel and Palestine will now be conducted in cash between Palestinian traders or importers and Israeli importers. And that, of course, will create major headaches in the Israeli economy, which has been moving towards cashless type transactions for the last years.
Really good to talk to you, Roger. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Pleasure.
Israel's war on Gaza and its ground offensive in Lebanon have weakened its economy. The cabinet has approved its wartime budget for next year, marking a shift in priorities. The $163 billion plan includes increasing defense funding, cutting spending and hiking taxes. But some opposition leaders have criticized the budget for maintaining funds to religious and nationalist causes. They say the move is meant to appease Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right coalition members, and it does little to boost growth. A Russian court has demanded that tech giant Google pay around $20 decillion. That's 20 followed by 33 zeros, more than all the money in the whole world, and obviously significantly more than the $2 trillion that Google is worth. Russian media outlet RBC says the fine is the total amount demanded by 17 Russian television channels and other media outlets whose output has been blocked from YouTube. The case started in 2020 and escalated after Russia's invasion of Ukraine 2 years later. China wants to overhaul 2 million lifts or elevators in aging apartment blocks as their residents also grow older. But the nation is struggling to find money to fund the project. Authorities are offering only partial subsidies and are pushing tenants to cover the costs. Some lift manufacturers have said they will pay for the installations and recoup expenses later from residents. The lifts, equipped with face scanners, charge residents a small fraction of $1 per ride. Africa is awash with big oil and gas discoveries. The continent's solar and wind energy is abundant too. The reserves could potentially transform the economies of many African nations. Despite that, more than 600 million African people have no access to electricity. Leaders are now trying to attract funding to help turn their energy fortunes into revenue. But multinational institutions aren't putting money into fossil fuel projects in order to help fight climate change. Now, investments by Western companies are scarce, and corruption is hampering the continent's development. African leaders discussed ways to end energy poverty on the continent by 2030 in Cape Town earlier this month during African Energy Week. The largest gathering of energy stakeholders on the continent was aimed at signing deals and attracting more investment. African nations say they should be allowed to exploit their oil and gas resources because they hardly contribute to carbon emissions currently. Meanwhile, a coalition of oil-producing African countries is seeking $5 billion to launch a so-called energy bank to fund projects on the continent. Separately, soaring petrol prices are pushing Nigerian drivers to switch to natural gas. The government set a target of 150,000 vehicle conversions by the end of the year, but critics question the cost and the shortage of petrol stations that offer the alternative fuel, even in the country's major cities. Al Jazeera's Ahmed Idris reports.
Attracted by cheaper fuel, more Nigerian motorists are making the switch to compressed natural gas.
Looking at the cost of petrol in Nigeria today, it is not more pocket-friendly to be running my car on petrol, and that's the reason why I switched to CNG.
Saving on gasoline, he says, gives them the opportunity to spend more on food. Ayola Sunday oversees this conversion center, one of two operating in the capital, Abuja.
Your vehicle is retrofitted. Your vehicle has the capability of using alternative fuels. All right, so you have the advantage, you have liberty to choose whichever fuel you want to use.
Nigeria has declared 2020 to 2030 a decade of gas, expanding its gas infrastructure.
In the last 1 year, we've been able to track by ourselves over $250 million in direct investment. These investments have gone to the increment in the number of conversion centers. It used to be just 7 of them. Today, we've identified more than 130 in the country.
Concerns about CNG safety is holding a lot of Nigerian motorists back, despite assurances by government. This is a scene of a CNG gas explosion recently in Nigeria.
The government aims to have 1 million vehicles retrofitted to use compressed natural gas by the end of 2025. 100,000 or so vehicles have so far made the switch out of the 20 million or so vehicles currently on Nigerian roads. Officials say the fuel will help eliminate many of the petrol supply challenges the country has been dealing with for decades.
Although conversion to CNG is slowly gaining traction, some Nigerians aren't entirely happy.
We have to queue for hours. Like, I've been on queue for more than 3 hours, which I've used the productive time of the day to come and queue to refuel.
Others are worried about the cost of retrofitting a vehicle, which ranges from $500 to $2,000.
It will take a lot of funding, a lot of support also from government. Is government ready to put in that support?
The government says it's working to resolve that.
We are seeing a progressive expansion from what used to be to where we are now expanding our footprint to additional states.
Nigeria has 206 trillion cubic feet of gas. Domestic utilization is very low. In some cases, the resource is simply flared. The government hopes deepening domestic gas utilization will reduce local demand for petroleum, which can be exported for foreign exchange. Ahmed Idris, Al Jazeera, Lagos.
Joining us now from Cape Town is NJ Ayok, who's the Executive Chairman of the African Energy Week and the Executive Chairman of the African Energy Chamber. Good to have you with us, NJ. Why has Africa been unable to tap into its vast energy resources and bring energy security to all of its people? What's holding it back?
We have in the continent today 600 million Africans without access to electricity, 900 without access to clean cooking technologies, most of them women. We are facing a financial crisis when it comes to financing, be it renewables or natural gas development. Financing and investments into energy, our energy infrastructure, or really driving up energy development has been our most critical need right now. That's why we're stuck in an energy crisis as we see today in Africa.
Should Africa be able to exploit its vast fossil fuel reserves over and above agreed emissions targets? Should Africa be excluded?
Of course, Africa should be excluded. Our greenhouse gas emissions are less than 3%. We are not the cause of the climate crisis, but we have a critical need for energy in the continent. You cannot look at a continent with this much need, and a lot of people that are still trying to cross the Mediterranean for jobs in Europe and not give them a fighting chance for opportunities here. With so much abundant natural gas, so much oil, there is no need for Africa to abandon its resources. That's why most African countries are establishing a drill, baby, drill energy policy, because this is time for them to use their resources to better the lives of the people. At the same time, bringing in renewables into our energy system, because it's not a binary issue. It's all of the above, and we need to have an energy mix in this continent, and that's what is needed right now.
And when it comes to renewable energy, what are the challenges in financing it? Does it need international partners to help transform renewables in Africa and renewables use, or is it something that it can do alone? What do you think of this idea to set up an energy bank to fund energy projects in Africa?
Of course, Africa needs international partners. It must welcome international partners. African countries have to create an enabling environment to attract more investment, because you can't do this on your own. An energy bank is so important right now, because it's going to be a transformational bank that's going to fund fossil fuels, and it's going to fund a lot of renewables as we do things ourselves. But most importantly, you have to always pay attention to where those funds are coming from. We've had $300 billion spent globally on renewable development. Just about $3 billion came to the African continent, most of it into international companies and very little into African companies. That has to change. We have to turn that around. So that's why there's the need for African funding to really drive that, because we have the sun, we have the wind, but sometimes the sun wouldn't blow forever. The wind wouldn't shine. The sun wouldn't shine forever. The wind wouldn't blow forever. You might need natural gas to deal with the intermittency and the base load. So we would have to do that, and we would have to fund a lot of that ourselves while working with international partners to continue that funding spree that we need for energy development in the continent.
Jay, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us. And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, I'm at @Finnegan on X. Try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC. Or you could drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.